The afternoon post had arrived with its usual clutter of circulars, bills, and one crisply folded letter from Tommy's bank. But on this particular Wednesday, there was also a parcel. Not the sort of parcel that arrives from a shop or a relative with predictable cheer, but the plain kind. Brown paper tied with faded string, the address scrawled in a hasty hand. It had no return name, only the faintly smudged ink of their Chelsea address, as though whoever had posted it had been more intent on getting rid of the thing than in assuring its safe arrival. Tuppence lifted it from the tray with a curious frown. Now what can this be? It looks as though it's been knocking about since the war. She held it to her ear with mock solemnity. Not ticking, at least. That's always encouraging. Tommy, sprawled in his favourite armchair with the Times folded across his knees, eyed it with less enthusiasm. Probably some dreadful sample. A new cleaning fluid or another scheme to save us money by spending twice as much. Not a bit of it, said Tuppence. With a flourish of the paper knife, she slit the string. Out slid a book, worn, much thumbed, its spine faded and fraying at the edges. The dust jacket, once bright, had lost most of its colour, but the title could still be read. The Merry Adventures of Cedric the Squirrel and His Forest Friends. Tommy groaned. Good Lord, we're being haunted by squirrels now. Unless Cedric is about to teach us how to grow radishes profitably, I can't imagine what use it will be. Tuppence ignored him. She smoothed her hand over the cover, her expression softening into something almost nostalgic. Look here, it's a children's book, and quite an old one by the look of it. How strange. She opened the flyleaf. In faded ink, a name was written in a careful, childish hand. Margaret Elston, 1941. Never heard of her, said Tommy. Should I have? No, but... Tuppence tilted her head thoughtfully. I do remember a Mrs. Elston, though. Didn't she live in Hampstead before the war? One of Mother's acquaintances. Yes, I'm almost sure of it. Margaret might have been her daughter. She turned another page. The paper was yellowed, the corners dog-eared. Quaint illustrations of squirrels in waistcoats and hedgehogs in hats cavorted across the margins, yet interspersed among them were faint pencil marks. A letter here, a number there. Tuppence leaned closer. Now that's odd. Tommy glanced over more from habit than interest. What's odd? These little underlinings, see? Someone's drawn a faint line beneath certain words. Not every page, only here and there. She flipped forward, her brow furrowing. And look, here's a penciled letter in the margin. An R, quite clearly. And on the next page, a T. Tommy sat up a little straighter. Children doodle, Tuppence. They underline words, they scribble letters. Perfectly normal. I once ruined a whole volume of Scott with a blue crayon when I was 5. Very likely, said Tuppence serenely. But this doesn't feel like childish scribble. It's too deliberate. Letters placed neatly in the margin, words carefully marked. There's a pattern. Pattern or no pattern, why send it to us? If your Mrs. Elston still exists, perhaps she mistook our address for that of some other unfortunate. Or perhaps the post office, in its wisdom, decided we were the proper foster parents for Cedric the Squirrel. But Tuppence's curiosity was thoroughly roused. She carried the book over to the fire, where the afternoon light slanted through the curtains. Do you know, she said slowly, it almost reminds me of a code. That caught Tommy. He folded the paper and leaned forward. A code? Now don't start seeing secret agents behind every oak tree. She smiled. You may scoff, but I can't shake the feeling. Margaret Elston, 1941. The very year children were being evacuated from London. Suppose this book belonged to a girl who was sent away from the city. Suppose she wrote in it, underlined things for a reason. Perhaps she meant to leave a message. Tommy gave a short laugh. For whom? Cedric the Squirrel? For herself, perhaps, or for someone she trusted. Tuppence flipped to the back. There's no inscription beyond the name. But think, Tommy. Wartime children were often mixed up in things beyond their years. They saw things, overheard things. What if this Margaret stumbled on something she wasn't supposed to know? Then she'd hardly record it in a squirrel's adventure. Unless she wanted to hide it, said Tuppence, eyes bright. What safer place than a children's tale? Who would bother to look? There was a pause as the fire crackled, sending shadows across the sitting-room walls. Outside, a gust of March wind rattled the window panes. The little house seemed suddenly less cosy, the parcel less innocent. Tommy coughed. All the same, there's no note, no explanation. For all we know, someone cleaned out their attic and thought of us as a convenient dumping ground. That won't do, said Tuppence firmly. She was already at the writing desk, pencil poised. We'll copy down the underlined words and see what comes of them. If it's nonsense, you may laugh at me to your heart's content. If not, Tommy interrupted, we'll be waist-deep in squirrels and secret codes. Really, Tuppence, one would think you longed for another adventure. Perhaps I do, she admitted. Her eyes gleamed with that familiar spark, the one that had led them into all manner of peril and delight since their youth. After all, the world has grown rather dull lately, hasn't it? A little puzzle might be just the thing. Tommy sighed theatrically, but there was fondness behind it. Very well. Fetch the notepaper. Let us see what Cedric and his forest friends are hiding. The task occupied them through the remainder of the afternoon. Tuppence turned each page with care, noting the faint marks, while Tommy wrote down the selected words in a neat list. The fire burned low, the clock ticked steadily, and the room filled with the odd hush of concentration. At first the words made no sense, a jumble of nouns, verbs, stray adjectives, but gradually, as the list lengthened, they began to form something more suggestive. Beware, promise, names, Tommy read aloud, his voice uncertain. It's still gibberish. Not entirely, murmured Tuppence. There's intent here. Someone underlined these with purpose. By the time dusk settled over the rooftops, the list had grown long enough to make Tommy frown in earnest. He gathered the pages together and studied them. All right, he conceded. It is peculiar. Still, it might be coincidence. Children play at spies. Perhaps. Tuppence closed the book gently. But why send it to us now, after all these years? Margaret Elston would be grown if she's alive. If she isn't, someone else wanted this book to reach us. Why? No answer came, only the steady tick of the mantel clock and the soft sigh of the wind outside. Tommy rose to stir the fire, watching the flames leap. When he turned back, he found Tuppence still holding the book, her fingers resting lightly on the faded name inside the cover. She looked up, her expression thoughtful, almost grave. "Tommy," she said quietly, "I don't think this is play. It looks like some sort of code." The following morning dawned pale and unsettled, a thin mist clinging to the garden like a reluctant guest. Tommy and Tuppence sat opposite one another at the breakfast table, the children's book lying between the teapot and the toast rack like a third, unwelcome companion. Tuppence was already poring over the penciled notes she had copied the night before. Tommy, who had an admirable capacity for consuming bacon while considering codes, pushed his plate aside with the air of a man bracing for duty. "Well," he said, "we can't very well sit here speculating forever. We ought to find out who this Margaret Elston was, and why on earth someone thought fit to send us her bedtime reading. A good start might be the local library." Tuppence nodded, pleased. "I was hoping you'd say that. Librarians, in my experience, are veritable treasure troves of gossip." By 11 o'clock they were in the reading room of the Chelsea Library, that hushed domain of polished wood, whispering patrons and dust motes spinning in the light. Behind the desk sat a woman of indeterminate age, with sharp spectacles and the expression of one who had long since learned the secrets of every resident in the district. "Yes, Margaret Elston," the librarian said thoughtfully, her voice carrying that crisp clarity which brooked no interruption. "I recall the name. She was an evacuee child during the war. Left London in 1940 with a small party, billeted in a country vicarage, if memory serves. Bright girl, always with her nose in a book." "Did she stay long?" asked Tuppence, leaning forward with polite eagerness. "Until 44, said the woman. And then, well, she vanished." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Vanished?" The librarian pursed her lips. "That's the word people used at the time. She was supposed to have gone home to her parents, but no one in the village ever saw her again. I remember there was some muttering. Her father worked in a Cipher office, you know, one of those hush-hush government places. There was talk that he was mixed up in something. Oh, I never knew what exactly. Codes, secrets, that sort of thing." Tuppence and Tommy exchanged a glance. "And her mother?" Tuppence asked softly. "Passed away before the war ended. Tuberculosis, I believe. After that, the family name simply faded out of conversation, but—" The librarian tapped her spectacles against her chin. "Now that you mention it, Someone else asked about that very book not long ago. His inquiry mentioned a riverside fete. That hint was enough to push their search upriver to Market Bellingham. A gentleman, foreign-sounding, thin with a moustache, came in quite intent, but when I told him I'd not seen the volume, he looked, disappointed, and left in a hurry. A chill threaded the air between them. They left the library with the mist lifting, replaced by a wan patch of sunlight that did little to ease Tommy's sense of unease. So, Margaret Elston disappears in 44, her father dabbles in ciphers, and 40-odd years later, a mysterious stranger comes sniffing round for her children's book. I don't like it, Tuppence. Smacks of the sort of thing that lands us in more trouble than goose liver ever did. Rubbish, said Tuppence briskly. It smacks of intrigue, and I for one intend to see where it leads. Their inquiries led them next to Market Bellingham, a sleepy little town 30 miles out, whose cobbled square and crooked church spire looked as though they'd barely changed since Cromwell's day. They took rooms in the inn, a place of sloping floors and faint smells of cider, and by afternoon were seated in the snug with 2 cups of tea, gathering what intelligence they could from the landlady. Margaret Elston, the woman repeated, wiping her hands on her apron. Aye, I remember the talk. Poor child disappeared after a fete, never came back. They said she ran away, fell for a young soldier most likely. Girls did in those days. She sniffed, half disapproval, half wistfulness. They said she might have eloped. Do you believe that? Asked Tuppence. The landlady tilted her head. Hard to say. She was a quiet one, not the sort to make a fuss. But then, love makes fools of us all, doesn't it? Her words hung in the air like a convenient explanation, one that seemed too easy. Tommy sipped his tea thoughtfully. A missing girl dismissed as a runaway, a cipher office father conveniently forgotten, a mysterious book arriving decades later. It was the sort of neat tale people clung to when they wanted a mystery buried. That evening they strolled through the square, lanterns flickering on as dusk gathered. The shops were shuttered, the church bells tolled the hour, and a few locals paused in their doorways to watch the strangers pass. Do you notice, murmured Tuppence, how people close ranks, as though they don't want old stories stirred up? Can you blame them? Said Tommy. It was wartime. People lived half in fear, half in weariness. If a girl disappeared, perhaps they preferred to believe she went off for romance rather than anything darker. Perhaps. Tuppence's gaze lingered on the darkened windows of the vicarage. But then why does her book resurface now? And why does a stranger inquire after it? There was no answer, only the sound of their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. Back at the inn, they sat once more with the book spread open under the lamplight. Tuppence's fingers traced the faded pencillings with renewed intensity. Elopement, she said, almost scornfully. It doesn't fit. Margaret was leaving a message, I'm sure of it. And look, here's something new. On this page, the underlined words spell out key. What sort of girl writes key in her storybook unless she's hiding something? Tommy leaned closer, the lamplight catching his frown. It could still be coincidence. Yes, Tuppence admitted, her eyes shining, but I don't think it is. As the inn clock chimed 9, a knock rattled their door. The landlady entered, a touch flustered. Beg pardon, sir, madam, but I thought you ought to know someone was asking about you not an hour ago. A man at the bar, quiet fellow, wanted to know what business you had with the Elston girl. When I said I didn't rightly know, he slipped away. Tommy rose sharply. Did you catch his name? No, sir. He paid cash, finished his pint, and was gone before anyone thought to ask. When she had gone, the couple exchanged a long, weighted silence. The atmosphere, which had begun with gentle curiosity, had shifted into something altogether darker. Tuppence closed the book firmly. There you are, Tommy. It isn't just an old romance or a runaway. Someone is interested enough to follow the trail even now. And if Margaret Elston's name still stirs such whispers after all these years, then we had better be very sure we understand why. Tommy nodded grimly. Whispers of the past, he said, and they're growing louder. That evening in their room at the Market Bellingham Inn, the book once again occupied centre stage between them. Outside, the lamplighter's glow drifted across the street, faintly distorted by a drizzle that blurred the outlines of parked motor cars. Inside, however, the room had been prepared like a headquarters of sorts. Pencils, notepads, and even a magnifying glass borrowed from the bureau lay assembled with military neatness. Tommy surveyed the scene with mild dismay. "I feel as though we're about to take our civil service exams all over again." Tuppence smiled serenely, sleeves rolled up. Cross-checking their earlier notes, new margin letters completed what they'd suspected: Lake House. "It could be part of one," Tuppence pointed out. "Perhaps Lake. Keep writing." For nearly an hour they bent over the book. Tuppence, turning the brittle pages with care, called out the underlined words, while Tommy, in his neat soldier's hand, recorded them on the pad. At first the jumble appeared absurd. Promise, danger, names, river, keep, silent. But gradually, like the ghost of a melody half heard, a message took shape. "Listen to this," said Tommy at last, rubbing his brow. "Lake House, promise broken, beware betrayal." The fire popped in the grate, and for a moment neither spoke. The childish scrawl, the simple underlinings, together they had conspired to whisper something that was not childish at all. Tuppence leaned back, her expression alight. There you have it. Not doodles, not idle underlinings, a message, plain as day. "Plain?" Tommy repeated. "It sounds more like one of those melodramas at the Odeon. Lake House, betrayal, promises. I half expect Cedric the squirrel to appear with a dagger behind his bushy tail." "Don't jest," Tuppence said firmly, though her eyes twinkled. "If Margaret Elston left this, it meant something to her. She wouldn't have hidden it otherwise." Hidden it, or simply kept herself amused during Latin lessons. "Tommy!" he grinned, enjoying the familiar rhythm of their sparring. "Very well, I admit it's curious. But what on earth is Lake House? Half the villages in England have a lake with a house beside it." "That," said Tuppence with determination, "is what we must discover." They resumed their deciphering. Some lines yielded clear hints, others were tantalizing fragments. The vicarage knows, the garden hides, names for safety. Each carried the flavor of a riddle, as though the girl had been constrained to write in hints rather than statements. At length Tommy sat back, flexing his cramped fingers. "We've the makings of a first-class puzzle, but no real solution. Still, one can't deny the drama of it. Beware betrayal. There's a phrase to chill the blood." "And perhaps a clue to what became of her," murmured Tuppence. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Shadows deepened along the walls, and the lamplight seemed suddenly more fragile. Tuppence turned the page and gasped. "Tommy, look!" The earlier tear at the back still mocked them, pages missing where answers ought to be. Tommy whistled. "Well, that's interesting. Our mysterious Cedric ends abruptly before his final adventure. Perhaps the villain caught him unawares. Don't be facetious. Those pages might have held the key. Whoever removed them knew what they were doing. Or, Tommy countered, they fell out. After all, this thing's held together by little more than stubbornness and nostalgia." But even as he spoke, he knew the probability was slim. The tearing was too deliberate, the absence too pointed. Tuppence closed the book slowly, her hand lingering on the faded cover. Missing pages, a vanished girl, a cipher about betrayal. It's beginning to sound less like a fairy tale and more like a tragedy. Tommy tried to lighten the mood. "Very well. Shall we take the parts? You as the gallant heroine, myself as the bumbling but loyal husband, and Cedric the squirrel as the villain. We'll sell out theatres from here to Piccadilly." She gave him a withering look. "You may laugh, but something lies behind this. Margaret Elston didn't vanish into thin air. If she left this code, it was to point someone, perhaps us, towards the truth." Tommy softened. "I don't doubt your instinct, old thing. It's just, well, codes and betrayal and missing children. It all sounds very serious, and serious things have a habit of turning awkward. And dangerous." "Dangerous or not, I'm not leaving it be," said Tuppence quietly. "I've the oddest feeling we're walking in the footsteps of a girl who tried to speak when no one would listen. The least we can do is listen now." They spent the remainder of the evening debating possibilities. Was Lake House an actual place or a metaphor? Did the underlined words suggest a betrayal within Margaret's own family, or beyond it? And who had sent them the book now, so many years later? By bedtime their notes were spread in uneven stacks across the table. Tuppence yawned, rubbing her eyes. "We'll get no further tonight. Tomorrow we must seek out where Margaret lived and whether a lake house exists nearby." Tommy gathered the papers, stacking them with soldierly precision. "And what if we find nothing? What if it was all a child's fancy? She regarded him steadily. Then we'll have wasted a few days, but if we find something— She let the sentence trail off, but her expression conveyed the rest. Tommy extinguished the lamps one by one. As darkness folded over the room, the last glint of firelight caught the children's book lying alone on the table, its cover faded, its story incomplete. The silence of the missing pages seemed louder than words. They retired upstairs, yet sleep proved elusive. Tommy lay awake, listening to the rain against the window. Beside him, Tuppence stirred, whispering into the dark. Betrayal, such a dreadful word. He reached for her hand. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps the poor girl simply ran away, as the landlady suggested. Or perhaps she tried to tell the truth, Tuppence murmured, and someone stopped her. The wind rattled the shutters in answer. Neither spoke again, but both knew the question of the missing pages would not leave them. Morning brought a brittle sunshine that glistened on the wet pavements. Over breakfast, Tuppence seemed unusually brisk. "Today," she declared, "we begin hunting for Lake House, and if the villagers are reluctant to speak, well—" She smiled mischievously. "I've never yet met a vicar's wife who could resist a sympathetic ear and a pot of jam." Tommy chuckled, relieved to see her spirits high again. "Very well, Commander, lead on. But mark my words, if Cedric the squirrel leaps from behind a hedge with a revolver, I shall demand double rations of bacon." "Agreed," said Tuppence, "but I think the real villains will prove far more human and far more dangerous." As they prepared to leave, the children's book slipped into Tuppence's handbag, its worn cover protruding like a secret eager to be revealed. The missing pages seemed to whisper after them as they stepped into the sunlit street, a promise unfinished, a truth concealed, waiting only for those bold or foolish enough to seek it. By mid-morning, their questions sent them further upriver to Havisham, a quieter bend where the locals spoke even more softly. The river was the sort that never hurried. Brown and sluggish, it crept between reed-choked banks as though reluctant to admit it had anywhere to go. On that particular afternoon, when Tommy and Tuppence arrived in the little riverside village of Havisham, the air hung damp with the scent of mud and moss, and the wind carried a faint metallic tang from the water. Their hired motorcar deposited them at the square, no more than a cluster of houses and a pub with faded lettering on its sign. From there they followed the curve of the road toward the quay, where barges lay tethered like patient beasts. Above the quay, crouched at the bend of the river, stood the house they had been told of, Georgian in origin, though age and neglect had stripped it of dignity. Its shutters rattled fitfully against the walls, paint peeled in jagged flakes, and a moss-darkened roof sagged with fatigue. Tuppence stood gazing at it, a shiver running through her despite the afternoon warmth. "If ever a house looked guilty of harbouring secrets, Tommy, that's the one." Tommy regarded it with a soldier's eye. "More likely it harbours rats. Still, I admit it's got atmosphere. Ideal spot for a disappearance." They presented themselves at the vicarage first. The Reverend Hughes, a mild-eyed man in his 60s with ink stains on his fingers, ushered them into a book-cluttered study that smelt of leather and pipe smoke. "Yes, I remember Margaret," he said gravely when they explained their interest. "A clever child, fond of reading, shy with strangers, but lively once she trusted you. She sang in the choir one summer, had quite a sweet voice." "What became of her?" asked Tuppence gently. The vicar's hands folded upon the desk. "That is the mystery. She attended the village fete one July evening in 1944. There was music on the green, lanterns strung between the elms, soldiers home on leave. She was seen laughing with friends at 8:30. By 10 she was gone, vanished as though the night swallowed her whole." Tommy frowned. "Was there a search?" "Indeed, for days. Every hedgerow, every barn, even the river was dragged. Nothing. No body, no trace. Eventually it was assumed she had returned to London, or perhaps—" He hesitated, then sighed. "Perhaps she eloped. That was the story some clung to." "Did anyone believe it?" Tuppence asked. The vicar shook his head slowly. "Some pretended to, but not I. Margaret was young, yes, but not reckless. And there were whispers about a man in a greatcoat, seen speaking with her that night." Later, as they walked the quay, the couple found confirmation of the story. A neighbour, a woman with a basket of laundry and a tongue eager for employment, leaned across her garden gate. Margaret Elston. Oh yes, I recall it well. Sad business. Poor lamb drowned in the river, most likely. They said a soldier was with her, but soldiers were with every girl then, weren't they? The river's taken many. Wicked currents. Yet no body was found, Tommy pointed out. The woman sniffed. Rivers don't always give back what they take, sir. As they walked away, Tuppence murmured, Convenient explanation, that. Too convenient. Indeed, said Tommy. Bodies have a way of surfacing eventually, unless, of course, they were never in the river to begin with. Evening settled like a veil over the village. They returned to stand before the Georgian house, watching lamplight flicker upon the water. The wind picked up, banging the shutters with a hollow insistence. Tommy rattled the gate. It swung open with a rusty groan. Shall we? Of course, said Tuppence, though her voice was low. If this was the last place Margaret was seen, we must. The garden was overgrown, nettles thick along the path. A single shoe lay half buried in the soil, long rotted and shapeless, as though time had forgotten it. They mounted the steps to the door, which yielded at Tommy's push. Inside, dust and darkness greeted them. The hall stretched long and narrow, its floorboards groaning underfoot. Cobwebs draped the corners. The air smelt of damp wood and mildew. On the wall, a cracked mirror reflected their lamplight back in warped fragments. Tuppence touched Tommy's arm. Listen. Somewhere deeper in the house, a sound echoed. Faint, deliberate. A footstep, or the sigh of an old beam. They held still, breath caught. After a moment it came again. Tap, tap, retreating into silence. Probably the wind, Tommy said quietly, though his hand had already closed around the torch in his pocket. They moved room to room, their lamplight dancing over faded wallpaper and abandoned furniture. A grand drawing-room faced the river, its curtains moth-eaten but still drawn. When Tuppence swept them back, the view was eerie. The moon rising above sluggish water, its reflection broken by ripples that seemed too regular, as if disturbed by something unseen. She shivered. Imagine the fate night, music drifting over the water, lanterns strung along this quay, Margaret slipping away with a soldier in a greatcoat. To hear. And not seen again, Tommy finished grimly. Upstairs the rooms lay desolate. In one a child's toy horse slumped on its side. In another a trunk stood half open, filled with moth-riddled uniforms. Tuppence bent over it, brushing away dust. Military, she murmured. Greatcoat, just as they said. Tommy peered in. Old but not ancient. Someone used these after the war. The question is, who? Before she could reply, a sharp crack rang out. They whirled. The sound had come from the floor below, a door slamming, hurried steps across the hall. Tommy darted to the landing in time to glimpse a figure darting out into the garden. Coat collar up, hat pulled low, gone into the shadows before pursuit was possible. "Tommy!" cried Tuppence. "Did you see him?" "Barely, but whoever he was, he didn't want us here." They hurried down, but the garden lay empty, only the reeds rustling in the river breeze. Footprints showed in the mud, leading toward the quay, then vanished into darkness. Back in the house, they searched the hall by lamplight. A small discovery awaited, an envelope tucked into the mantelpiece crack. Inside lay a fragment of paper, yellowed with a single penciled word, Promise. Tuppence's eyes widened. Tommy, it matches the cipher, the very same word we copied. Tommy examined it grimly. Then Margaret was here, or someone connected with her was. Either way, this house knows more than it cares to say. They left the place reluctantly, securing the door behind them. The quay was deserted, save for the water's dull slap against the pilings. The lamplight shimmered uncertainly, and their footsteps echoed as though a dozen invisible companions walked beside them. Tuppence slipped her hand through Tommy's arm. "The villagers may believe she drowned, but I cannot. Not after this. She came here that night, and something happened within those walls." Tommy's jaw tightened, and someone still lingers to keep it hidden. At the inn later, over a supper they scarcely tasted, they pieced together the day's impressions. A shy girl, gone after a fate. A man in a greatcoat. A house by the river that still seemed to breathe with secrets. And always the whisper of betrayal in the cipher. "Do you think," Tommy asked slowly, "that Margaret entrusted her secret to someone? A vicar, perhaps? Or one of her friends?" Tuppence shook her head. If she did, they kept it silent. No, she left her message in the book, hidden in childish games, waiting until someone chose to listen. And someone else, Tommy added, is determined that message remains buried. They exchanged a look across the lamplit table. Outside, the river crept by in silence, carrying its secrets as it always had. But now Tommy and Tuppence were part of its story, and they knew they would not leave until they had learned the truth. The river house had drawn them back like a magnet. Though their steps were cautious on the weed-choked path, there was no disguising the resolve in Tuppence's stride. By late afternoon they were once again inside its walls, torchlight cutting narrow beams through gloom. Back to the scene of the crime, Tommy muttered. If there was a crime, of course. There was, Tuppence replied firmly, brushing a cobweb from her sleeve. You don't need a body to prove it. You only need whispers, and this house is full of them. The air was heavy with dust, thick enough to taste. In the hall, the tall grandfather clock still stood, its hands frozen at 12. Yet in the stillness its mechanism ticked faintly, like a pulse buried deep inside. Tuppence shivered. How strange! Stopped but not silent, rather like this story, unfinished, yet alive. They climbed the staircase, boards creaking underfoot. On the second floor they explored once more, passing through a child's room where faded wallpaper bore a pattern of sailing boats, and another where curtains hung in moth-eaten shreds. Finally, they mounted to the attic, a narrow space under the eaves pungent with dust and the faint, acrid smell of mildew. There, in a corner beneath a broken chair, Tuppence's eye caught a flash of leather. She stooped, dragging free a battered satchel. The straps had rotted, and the initials M.E. were scratched faintly on the flap. "Margaret Elston," she breathed. Tommy whistled low. "Well, that settles whose attic this was. Open it, old thing." The clasp gave after a struggle. Within lay a muddle of paper, school copybooks swollen with damp, a pair of rusted compasses, and, most telling of all, several loose pages torn crudely from a book. Tuppence spread them on the floorboards. The paper was stained, edges crinkled, but the illustrations of Cedric the squirrel were unmistakable. And there, scrawled across the margins, more penciled letters. She bent close, lips moving as she read. A promise kept in silence. And here, names written in the margins. "Tommy, these are more fragments of the cipher." He crouched beside her, holding the torch steady. So the missing pages weren't destroyed. They were hidden here. "And deliberately so," Tuppence added. "Look, this one's folded carefully, as though she meant someone to find it." They pored over the pages. The words were scattered, but together they suggested something more ominous than before. Promise kept in silence, names written in the margins, the vicarage knows. Tommy rubbed his chin. Not much better than riddles. Still, I don't like the sound of names written in the margins. Names of whom? "Of those betrayed," said Tuppence softly. That must be it. Margaret knew something dangerous enough to hide in code. The attic seemed to grow colder as she spoke. Wind sighed through the broken tiles, stirring the dust. Their torch beam quivered on the beams above, where cobwebs trembled like spun veils. Tuppence gathered the pages reverently. "We mustn't leave them here. They may be all that remains of her truth." "Agreed," said Tommy, "though I can't say I relish carrying Cedric the squirrel's death warrant in my pocket." They descended once more to the hall. The grandfather clock loomed against the wall, its pendulum stilled, its face shadowed. Yet again the faint ticking could be heard, irregular, as though the house itself refused to fall silent. As they paused to listen, a sound shattered the stillness, a scrape of movement from the back garden. Both stiffened. Tommy was first to the door, swinging it open. Torchlight spilled across the tangled garden where nettles swayed. At the far edge, half hidden by the shrubs, a figure darted, small, quick, and desperate, a coat collar pulled high, a hat low over the brow. "Stop!" Tommy shouted, vaulting down the steps. But the figure was already away, plunging toward the riverbank. Branches cracked, footsteps thudded, then silence swallowed all. By the time Tommy reached the quay, the intruder was gone. The only trace was a ripple across the water, spreading outward like a vanishing signature. He returned, breathing hard, to find Tuppence waiting in the doorway, pale but steady. "Whoever it was," she said, "they knew we were here, and they didn't want us finding that satchel." They retreated inside, shutting the door firmly, though the house felt no safer for it. Shadows pressed close, and the torch beam caught odd glints, nails rusting in plaster, glass shards in corners. "Tommy," Tuppence murmured, "that intruder could have been watching us all along." "Unpleasant thought," he admitted, "though perhaps comforting. If someone's so eager to stop us, it suggests we're on the right trail." She smiled faintly. "That's one way of putting it." In the dining room they laid the pages upon the table, weighting them with a candlestick. The lamplight flickered, catching the penciled scrawls. Tuppence traced them with her finger, eyes intent. "See here. This page mentions the garden hides. Could it mean this garden? Perhaps she hid more. Or perhaps she was being poetic. Children often are." "Children also tell the truth more plainly than adults," said Tuppence. "We mustn't forget that." A floorboard creaked overhead. They froze. The sound came again, deliberate, above the hall. Tommy snatched the torch, darting back up the staircase 2 steps at a time. The landing was empty, rooms silent. He swung the light across bare walls, dust dancing in its path. Nothing. He returned grim-faced. No one, unless they've learnt to vanish into thin air. Tuppence gestured to the door. Then they slipped out. Whoever they are, they know this house better than we do. As twilight deepened into night, they finally gathered the torn pages, wrapping them carefully in brown paper. Tuppence tucked the bundle into her handbag, fastening it with unusual gravity. "These are evidence," she said, Margaret's voice across the years. "We can't let them be silenced again." Tommy extinguished the lamp, and together they stepped into the dusk. The river gleamed faintly under the rising moon, sluggish, secretive. Behind them the house loomed, its shutters banging like distant applause. Yet even as they walked away, they felt eyes upon them from the shadows, watching, waiting. At the inn, supper was a distracted affair. Tommy toyed with his knife and fork. Tuppence spread the pages on their room's small desk once more, poring over them by candlelight. "Promise kept in silence, Byrne," she repeated. "It sounds almost like a vow. Perhaps Margaret had sworn not to reveal something, yet she did, in Cipher." Tommy leaned over her shoulder. "And names written in the margins. That doesn't sound like romance or elopement to me. It sounds like a list someone didn't want known." Tuppence's eyes gleamed. And if Margaret knew the betrayer of that list, it would explain why she vanished. They fell silent, the only sound the steady tick of the inn's clock. It echoed strangely, reminding them of the grandfather clock in the river house, its frozen hands still measuring something unseen. Later, as Tommy prepared for bed, he looked out of the window. Across the square, a figure lingered briefly by the lamp-post, as though watching the inn. When Tommy blinked, the figure was gone, swallowed by the night. He returned to Tuppence, his tone grim. "It seems we've acquired company, and not the sort to announce themselves politely." Tuppence closed the satchel pages with a decisive snap. "Then let them watch. We've no intention of turning back now. Margaret Elston entrusted her secret to paper. We shall see it through." And as the candle guttered low, the words from the torn pages seemed to whisper in the room with them. Promises, names, silence, and betrayal. Morning in Havisham broke with a watery sun that struggled through thin clouds, throwing a pale light across the cobbled square. Market stalls were already setting up, their canvas awnings snapping in the breeze, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Yet beneath the village's quiet rhythm, Tommy and Tuppence sensed the undercurrent of something guarded, something left unsaid. Over breakfast at the inn, Tuppence laid out their plan with a neatness that would have impressed a general. "We need to talk to those who knew Margaret. The vicar gave us names and the satchel gave us clues. Let's begin making a list." She took a hotel notepad and wrote 3 names with crisp certainty: Mr. Dunning, bookseller; Mrs. Harrow, schoolteacher; Captain Reed, retired officer. Tommy buttered his toast with deliberate slowness. 3 suspects, each delightfully mysterious: a bitter tradesman, a nervous spinster, and a scarred officer. All we need now is a stormy night and a missing will. "You'll have your storm soon enough," said Tuppence, "but don't joke. Each of them may hold a key." Mr. Dunning's shop lurked in a side street off the square, a dingy cave where dust and gloom hung as thickly as the smell of ink. The proprietor himself was thin as a bookmark, with hair plastered down and a mouth that pursed as though perpetually sucking on a lemon. He greeted them without warmth. "What do you want?" "We're making inquiries about Margaret Elston," Tuppence said pleasantly. At once his eyes sharpened. "That name again. You're not the first to come poking about. A month ago some fellow with a foreign accent asked after her. Now you two. What business is she of yours?" "We're interested in her disappearance," Tommy replied smoothly. "You knew her, I believe." "Knew her as a customer," Dunning said curtly. "A quiet girl, always borrowing books above her age, Greek myths, detective stories. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but she had secrets. Children do, you know." "Secrets?" Tuppence prompted. He shrugged, but the movement was theatrical, as though meant to impress. "Wouldn't surprise me if she ran off with a soldier. Or worse. Mark my words, this village is better off forgetting her. You dig into old graves, you find bones." "And yet you're still talking about her," Tommy remarked. At that, Dunning's lips thinned. "Because you forced me. I lost enough in the war. My ration permits revoked, my livelihood ruined while others grew fat. Don't expect me to weep over one evacuee girl. She should have minded her own business." His words were harsh, but to Tuppence's ear they rang hollow, more like performance than confession. Outside, she murmured to Tommy, "He protests too much. If he wanted us to ignore her, he could simply have said nothing. Instead, he gave us a speech." "True," said Tommy, "and speeches are rarely innocent." Their next visit took them to a neat red-brick house with lace curtains and flower pots lining the windowsill. Mrs. Harrow, Margaret's former teacher, opened the door with evident reluctance. A small woman in her late 50s, she had nervous eyes and hands that fluttered at her apron as though she longed to close the door again. "Margaret," she repeated, her voice low. Yes, I taught her. Clever child. Too clever for her own good." "In what way?" Tuppence asked gently. Mrs. Harrow twisted her hands. She listened when she oughtn't. Asked questions no child should. About the war, about codes and messages. She said her father worked with ciphers. I told her not to chatter, but she only smiled. A strange smile, as if she knew more than she should. Her gaze darted past them to the street and her voice dropped. "It isn't safe to ask about her. People don't like it. Best to let sleeping dogs lie." "Yet you still remember her," Tommy said. Mrs. Harrow's eyes filled with sudden tears. "I remember because she vanished. A pupil doesn't simply vanish. But I can tell you no more. Please, go." She closed the door before they could press further. Tuppence sighed, nervous as a mouse in a cat's paw. "But I believe she knows something." "And is too frightened to say," Tommy agreed. "That makes her interesting." Their final call took them to a small cottage at the village edge, ivy climbing its walls, and a Union Jack neatly folded in the window. Captain Reed answered the door himself, tall and broad, his bearing unmistakably military. Yet scars traced his cheek and temple, lending his charm a faintly sinister air. "Margaret Elston," he repeated, ushering them inside. His voice was rich, almost too smooth. "Yes, I recall her. She was a slip of a girl, always with a book. We met at the fete once or twice." "And the night she vanished?" asked Tommy. Reed paused, pouring sherry into glasses with practiced ease. "I saw her in the crowd, yes, talking with friends. I can't say what became of her after. Rumours abounded. Some said she drowned, others that she ran off with a soldier." "Were you the soldier?" Tuppence asked quietly. For the briefest instant something flickered in his expression. Then he smiled. "No, madam. My scars do not make me a villain. I was injured at Anzio, and since then I've had little interest in romantic pursuits, though I dare say my reputation in the village paints me darker." They sipped sherry in silence for a moment, the clock ticking. Reed's eyes, steady and watchful, never quite left them. When they departed, Tommy said under his breath, "Too smooth, that one. Polished charm like a blade. But is he concealing guilt or only loneliness?" That night at the inn, with the satchel pages spread on the desk once more, Tommy was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. He leapt from bed, pulling on his dressing gown, while Tuppence clutched her robe and hurried after. In the sitting room below, a window hung broken, curtains swaying in the night breeze. Papers lay scattered across the floor. The bundle of Margaret's torn pages was gone, but the battered satchel itself was under Tuppence's arm at the time. Whoever broke in had taken only the loose leaves. Tommy dashed to the door, flinging it open in time to glimpse a figure bolting down the lane, long coat flying. The man glanced back once, moonlight catching the scar along his cheek. Then he was gone. "Captain Reed," Tommy said grimly when he returned. "Or someone who wants us to think so," Tuppence countered. "The scar makes him memorable. Too memorable. Could be a disguise, or a deliberate red herring." The next day, word of the break-in spread quickly. At the bookshop, Mr. Dunning greeted them with a sneer. "You stir up trouble, and now you've been robbed. Serves you right, always meddling where you're not wanted." "Do you know who broke into our room?" Tuppence asked. "Of course I don't," he snapped. "But if I did, I'd shake his hand. We don't need London meddlers dragging up old scandals. Margaret Elston's gone, and good riddance." He slammed a ledger shut so violently that dust puffed into the air. Customers turned to stare. Theatrics, Tuppence thought, yet his anger seemed more show than substance. Back at the inn, she turned to Tommy. "Dunning is desperate to drive us away. That alone makes him suspicious." "And yet," Tommy replied, "the figure I saw had Reed's scar. We can't dismiss that." By evening, the square was abuzz. Some whispered Reed was guilty, others claimed Dunning would happily frame anyone to hide his own sins. Mrs. Harrow, when questioned again, wrung her hands until they were white. "Don't ask me," she pleaded. "I know nothing. Nothing." Her eyes darted to the shadows as though fearing unseen ears. Tommy and Tuppence returned to their room, unsettled. The satchel pages were gone, but their memory lingered. Promise kept in silence, names in the margins. 3 suspects, Tommy mused aloud. Each with motive, each with secrets. Dunning, bitter and angry. Harrow, nervous and evasive. Reed, charming but scarred. Which one do we trust? Tuppence fastened the window latch firmly. None of them, not yet. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. In the hush that followed, the village seemed less a quaint riverside hamlet, and more a stage where shadows moved, each concealing truths yet to be revealed. The inn's small upstairs room had grown oppressive with the passing hours. Candle stubs guttered in saucers, sending nervous shadows twitching across the wallpaper's faded roses. The only sounds were the scratch of Tommy's pencil on notepaper and the steady ticking of the mantel clock, so loud it seemed to measure out each breath they took. On the table between them lay their copied transcripts of the rescued pages, the fragments noted earlier, and a spread of notes that looked more like a codebreaker's desk than a country inn's furniture. Tommy leaned back, rubbing at his eyes. "I've always maintained that puzzles are best confined to the crossword in the Times. This, however, has the singular disadvantage of being about life and death. And frankly, Tuppence, I prefer acrostics." Tuppence, still bent over the papers, ignored his weariness. Her voice was brisk but taut. "Stop grumbling and read what we've got so far. The fragments aren't random any longer. They fit together." He gathered the sheets, shuffled them into order, and began to read. Lake House, betrayal, promise kept in silence, names written in the margins, vicarage knows, sold names for safety, deaths abroad. The words hung in the close air. Tuppence whispered, "There it is, the heart of it. Margaret Elston was warning of a traitor." Tommy frowned. "A double agent? Here, in this sleepy place?" "Why not? Wartime villages were full of evacuees, billets, officials posted to quiet corners. A perfect hiding place for someone with secrets. And if Margaret overheard or found a paper she shouldn't, she might have known more than was safe." He set down the pages, his tone suddenly grave. "Sold names for safety. That's not child's fancy. That means someone betrayed British agents to save their own skin. And the result was death. Agents abroad who never came home." Tuppence lifted the faded squirrel illustration, tracing the penciled scrawl in its margins. She hid it in a storybook, knowing no one would suspect. Clever and tragic. The hours wore on. Outside, the wind rattled the inn's shutters, and the fire in the grate had sunk to a dull glow. The room seemed to close in, claustrophobic with paper, candle smoke and tension. Tommy pushed back from the table, stretching his legs. If the cipher is right, the traitor must be one of those still here. Dunning, Harrow, Reed, each has shadows in their story. Tuppence clasped her hands together tightly. and each may have had reason to silence Margaret. Which raises the awkward question, Tommy muttered, of whether we are in line to be silenced too. There came a sound, faint, deliberate. A knock at the door. Both froze. The clock had just struck midnight, and no one in the inn had reason to disturb them. The knock came again, softer this time, but urgent. Tommy crossed to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Best stand back, old thing. Could be our midnight assassin." Tuppence's eyes were steady. "Or our midnight messenger." He opened the door cautiously. On the threshold stood Mrs. Harrow, her shawl clutched tight, face pale, eyes darting as though she expected pursuit. "You must leave," she whispered. "Leave at once before it's too late." They drew her quickly inside, shutting the door. She stood trembling in the candlelight, hands twisting her shawl to threads. "Mrs. Harrow," Tuppence said gently, "why have you come?" The schoolteacher's voice shook. "Because you're stirring it up again. The past, the things best left buried. You don't know how dangerous it is. Margaret tried, and look what happened to her." Tommy's tone was sharp. "What did happen to her? You know more than you've said." Mrs. Harrow pressed her hands to her temples. "I can't. I daren't. There are people, still here, who wouldn't hesitate to silence you, just as they silenced her." Tuppence caught her arm. "You taught her. You cared for her. If you know, you must tell us." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. She was bright, too bright. She listened. She asked questions. She wrote things down. I told her not to meddle. I told her to forget. But she wouldn't. And one day she was gone. They said elopement or drowning. But I knew. I knew she had been taken because she knew too much. Her voice dropped to a broken whisper. "She came to me once with that very book. Said there were names hidden there. Names of men who had betrayed their own. She said her father had kept lists and she'd seen them. She said she was afraid." "Who were the names?" Tommy demanded. "I never saw," Mrs. Harrow moaned. "She wouldn't show me. She said it wasn't safe. And then she vanished. And I have lived in fear ever since." Silence fell. The only sound was the frantic tick of the clock. Tuppence spoke softly. "You came here tonight because you fear the same fate for us." "Yes," Mrs. Harrow said, clutching her shawl tighter. "You must go back to London. Leave this alone. Don't make the same mistake she did." Tommy's voice was firm. "And if we leave, the truth remains buried. The traitor remains unmasked." Her face contorted with anguish. "Better one traitor than more graves." "But those agents, those lives lost abroad," Tuppence said steadily. "Do they not cry out for justice?" Mrs. Harrow's shoulders shook. She turned her face away. "I can't help you, only warn you, please. Please leave before it's too late." With that, she wrenched the door open and slipped into the corridor, her footsteps fleeing down the stairs. For a long time, Tommy and Tuppence stood in silence, the door ajar to the empty passage. Then Tommy closed it, bolting it firmly. "Well," he said grimly, "that settled any notion of this being a mere elopement." Tuppence gathered the scattered pages with trembling hands. Margaret was silenced. Mrs. Harrow knows it, even if she cannot say how. And if the cipher is true, we are hunting a traitor who sold names for safety. "Which makes us targets too," Tommy remarked. He forced a smile, though his eyes were serious. Cheerful thought for bedtime. Tuppence blew out the candles, and the room plunged into darkness. Yet even as they lay awake in the narrow inn bed, the words of the cipher seemed to burn behind their eyes. Sold names for safety. And the warning of Mrs. Harrow echoed like a tolling bell. Leave before it's too late. Morning in Havisham broke deceptively gentle. Sunlight dappled the square, a milk cart rattled past, and sparrows fussed in the gutters as though the world had never known war or whispered secrets. Yet in the schoolyard at the edge of the village a darker story unfolded. It was the inn's maid who brought the news, breathless as she knocked on Tommy and Tuppence's door. "Terrible, sir, terrible. Poor Mrs. Harrow, found in the garden. They say she fell." Within minutes the couple were hurrying down the narrow lane toward the school. The building stood plain and solid, its brickwork warmed by years of sun, its windows glinting innocently. But the garden behind was no longer innocent. Villagers clustered in anxious knots, their whispers rising like the rustle of dry leaves. Mrs. Harrow lay near the stone wall that bordered the vegetable patch, her body twisted unnaturally, her shawl caught on the brambles. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, and in the stillness there was an air of terrible finality. The village constable stood guard, red-faced and out of his depth. "Must have slipped," he muttered to Tommy. "These old walls are treacherous. She likely fell in the night." Tuppence knelt, her gaze sharp. Slipped, perhaps, but why would she be in the garden at night? And why? Her hand brushed the soil near the body. She lifted something small, a pressed flower, flattened and brittle, its petals long faded. "Look at this, Tommy, from the children's book." He bent close, frowning. "One of Margaret's flowers?" "Yes, I remember the illustration. Cedric the squirrel presenting a flower at the forest feast. It was pressed into the book, and now, here." She placed it carefully in her handkerchief, eyes blazing. "This is no accident." The villagers' whispers grew. Some muttered of tragedy, others of scandal. But all fell silent when Captain Reed appeared at the edge of the crowd. His tall figure, immaculate even in country tweeds, cut a striking line. He removed his hat solemnly, scars catching the morning light. "Mrs. Harrow," he said gravely, "was a good woman. To end like this," he shook his head, "it is a loss to the village." Yet more than one pair of eyes turned toward him with suspicion. Tommy noticed the ripple, the half-nods exchanged, and he also noticed the mud clinging fresh to Reed's boots. "Were you here earlier, Captain?" Tommy asked casually. Reed's gaze did not falter. "I walk each morning by the school garden, my habit since my return from the war. The quiet suits me. If that condemns me, so be it." Back at the inn, over coffee untouched, Tommy gave voice to his thoughts. "It is too neat. Mrs. Harrow warns us at midnight, and by dawn she is dead. If that's coincidence, I'm a Dutchman." Tuppence stared into the hearth where the fire had sunk to ashes. She was silenced. She knew too much. Perhaps she was on the point of telling us the truth. "And the flower?" Tommy asked. "A message or a mistake. Either way, it ties her death directly to Margaret Elston's book." He leaned back, sighing. "So we are left with suspects. Dunning with his bitterness, Reed with his charm and his scars, and who else? Someone we have not yet considered? The vicar, perhaps, or another villager hiding behind silence?" Tuppence shook her head. "No, the cipher points to betrayal, a double agent. Margaret hid the truth and Mrs. Harrow feared it. The killer is among those three. We must simply strip away the masks." That afternoon, the couple retraced Mrs. Harrow's last steps. The schoolroom was still, dust motes dancing in beams of light through tall windows. Children's desks stood neatly arranged, slates stacked, a chalkboard covered with yesterday's sums. But in one drawer of the teacher's desk, they found a small notebook, its pages filled with hurried scrawl. Tuppence read aloud. "The book is dangerous. She said there were names. I tried to forget, but the river house holds them still." She closed it gently. She knew. She lived in fear for years, and at last, when we pressed her, she came to warn us. That cost her her life. Outside, footsteps echoed on the stone path. Tuppence glanced through the window. Captain Reed stood there, smoking, his eyes fixed on the garden where Mrs. Harrow had died. That evening, the inn parlour was alive with speculation. Villagers spoke in low voices, casting sidelong glances. "It's Reed, mark my words," muttered one man, "always skulking about. And those scars, no good comes of scars." "Or Dunning," whispered another. "He hated the girl, hated the world. Wouldn't surprise me if he hated Mrs. Harrow too." The talk grew feverish, suspicion spreading like smoke. Tommy and Tuppence listened, saying little. At length Tommy murmured, "If Reed wished to silence her, why risk being seen near the garden? Too obvious, unless he wishes suspicion to fall on him, diverting it from another." "Or unless," Tuppence countered, "he believes his position too strong to be shaken." They sought out Dunning the next morning. The bookseller stood behind his counter, lips pursed, eyes defiant. "Mrs. Harrow is dead," Tuppence said evenly. He gave a sharp laugh. "And what has that to do with me? People die every day." "You hated her," Tommy remarked. "I hated many people," Dunning snapped. "What of it? She was a fool, always wringing her hands. If she's gone, that's no loss to anyone." His words shocked, yet his eyes glittered as though enjoying their effect. "You denounce too loudly," Tuppence said quietly. "It makes you sound guilty, Mr. Dunning." "Better guilty than gullible," he spat. "Run back to London with your codes and fairy tales. Havisham has no need of you." Later, as they walked the quay, the river lapping dully at the pilings, Tommy said, "Theatrical, as ever. But does theatrical guilt conceal innocence or real guilt dressed up as bluster?" Tuppence's gaze lingered on the sluggish water. "Either way, the truth lies in the cipher. Margaret's book led us here, and Margaret's book will name the traitor." She touched the folded handkerchief in her pocket where the pressed flower lay. "This was no accident. It is a sign, Tommy, a sign left for us." That night, sleep eluded them. Every creak of the inn seemed a footstep, every rustle of the shutters a hand reaching. Tuppence lay awake, staring into darkness, replaying Mrs. Harrow's final plea, "Leave before it's too late." But she whispered instead, fiercely, "No, we'll stay. We'll finish what Margaret began." And in the stillness, the flower in her pocket seemed to carry its own fragile weight of testimony, silent, delicate, and damning. The storm broke just as Tommy and Tuppence reached the ivy-clad cottage on the far edge of the village. Rain lashed across the hedgerows, wind bent the elms into shuddering boughs, and the river behind them churned with a restless force that seemed to echo the turmoil of their thoughts. Captain Reed's home stood slightly apart, a handsome cottage whose red brick was almost hidden under ivy grown thick as armour. Light flickered in the windows, warm and steady against the storm's fury, yet even that light looked watchful, as though gauging their intent. Tuppence pulled her coat tighter. "He'll not thank us for calling at this hour." "No," said Tommy grimly, "but I doubt we'd be thanked at any hour. And I've no taste for waiting until Reed decides to find us instead." He rapped sharply at the door. After a moment it opened. Captain Reed stood framed in lamplight, his tall figure as crisp as ever in a dark jacket, his scarred cheek catching the glow. He regarded them with calm surprise. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, out braving the weather for my sake? I'm honoured. Do come in." The cottage interior was both comfortable and spare. A fire glowed in the grate, books lined the walls in military order, spines gleaming. Lamps were lit but turned low, their yellow halos faint against the storm-thrashed windows. Reed gestured them to chairs. "Sherry? Or something stronger? Nights like this invite confidences, don't they?" "We didn't come for comfort," Tommy said bluntly. "No," Reed replied smoothly, pouring drinks regardless. "You came for Margaret Elston. Everyone does, sooner or later." The name hung in the room like a challenge. Tuppence leaned forward. "You knew her well." Reed's hand, steady as a soldier's, placed the glasses on the table. Better than most. She was a lonely child, curious, far too quick with questions. After the fete, when she should have gone home, she came here. She was frightened. "She came here?" Tommy repeated sharply. "Yes." Reed settled into his chair, the firelight deepening the scar along his cheek. "She asked if she could stay until morning. I agreed. I thought to return her to the vicarage at dawn, but when I woke she was gone." "And you never told anyone?" Tuppence asked. Reed's smile was thin. "And invite the villagers to whisper that I spirited away a girl half my age? Hardly. Better silence than suspicion." Tommy's gaze was hard. "That silence may have cost her life." Reed's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she went to someone else, someone who promised more than shelter." The rain battered harder, rattling the panes. The air in the room grew heavy, as though confession thickened it. Tuppence drew out the pressed flower wrapped in a handkerchief. "This was found by Mrs. Harrow's body yesterday, a flower from Margaret's book. Mrs. Harrow warned us at midnight and was dead by morning. Do you call that coincidence, Captain?" For a moment, Reed stared at the fragile thing, its faded petals trembling in her hand. He swallowed his sherry in one gulp. "No," he said at last. "No coincidence. Margaret's secret still festers, and those who fear it will kill to bury it." "Then you know the secret?" Tommy pressed. Reed rose abruptly, pacing before the hearth. His voice hardened. "I know enough. Margaret spoke of names her father had guarded, names of men who betrayed their own countrymen. She said one lived here, in this very village. I told her not to speak of it again, but she laughed at my fear. his hand clenched on the mantel. "Do you know what it is to watch comrades die abroad, not from enemy fire but from treachery, to come home scarred while traitors lived comfortably behind closed curtains?" Tuppence's tone was steady. "You believe you know who the traitor was?" Reed turned then, and from a drawer in the bureau he drew a photograph, yellowed at the edges, torn down the middle. He laid it on the table between them. The image showed Margaret, young and smiling, her hair tied back with a ribbon. Beside her stood a man, younger then but recognizable, eyes sharp, jaw set. "Dunning," Tommy breathed. "Yes," Reed said quietly. "Your embittered bookseller. He was not always confined to his shop. During the war he wore two faces, British patriot and something darker. He sold names to save himself. Margaret knew. That is why she vanished." The storm howled and the lamps flickered as though doubting the truth. Tuppence studied the torn photograph. "Why keep this all these years, Captain?" Reed's voice was low. "Because proof is scarce and memory is doubted. I kept it because I knew one day the truth would matter. And now it returns." Tommy narrowed his eyes. "Yet this doesn't fit with Margaret's cipher. She wrote of promises, betrayal, the vicarage, not simply Dunning. And you, why did she come to you if not because you too were involved?" Reed's scarred cheek twitched. "Because I was safe, or so she thought." The air grew tense, suspicion settling heavy as the storm. Tommy paced, restless. "You tell us you sheltered her, yet she disappeared from your very house. You produce a photograph conveniently incriminating Dunning, but the cipher we've pieced together doesn't absolve you. Why should we trust your version?" Reed met his gaze squarely. "You shouldn't. Not entirely. I'm a man with failures enough, but I did not betray my country. I did not kill that child. Whatever else you believe that." Silence fell. The rain lashed harder, a branch scraping the window like fingers. Tuppence folded the photograph, her eyes troubled. "Margaret was torn between fear and defiance," she murmured. "If she trusted you, why would she vanish? Unless someone else came for her, unless she followed another promise." Reed sank back into his chair, exhaustion in his shoulders. "Perhaps. All I know is that she left this house alive. What befell her afterward, only God and the betrayer know." When at last they rose to leave, the storm still raged, and Reed accompanied them to the door. His figure filled the frame, lamplight behind, rain beyond. "Take care," he said. "You prod at a nest of serpents, and serpents strike when threatened." His words lingered as they stepped into the night, the rain soaking their coats, the photograph safe in Tuppence's handbag. Back at the inn, with the storm still pounding the windows, they laid the photograph on the table. The young Margaret smiled up at them, Dunning's younger face beside hers. Tommy said slowly, "If Reed is telling the truth, Dunning is our man. But if Reed lies, then he's drawn the perfect curtain to hide behind." Tuppence traced Margaret's image with her finger. "The cipher must decide. Margaret left her truth scattered through the book, and until we fit it together, we can trust no one. Not Reed, not Dunning, perhaps not even the vicarage itself." The storm raged, but within their room another storm brewed, built of questions, lies, and the fragile hope that one child's scribbles might yet unmask a traitor. The storm rolled in from the river like a conqueror, thunder rattling the very stones of Havisham Manor. The vicar had secured the Havisham Manor library for the meeting, neutral ground, large enough for witnesses and the constable. Lightning slashed the sky, its glare flaring across tall windows and shelves upon shelves of solemn, leather-bound books. In the manor library, where oak panels gleamed darkly and a great brass lamp flickered over the long table, Tommy and Tuppence had set the stage for their final confrontation. Laid out upon the polished wood were the cipher fragments, weighted at the corners by candlesticks to keep them from the draughts that whistled under the old windows. The words leapt eerily in the shifting light. Promise kept in silence, names in the margins, vicarage knows, sold names for safety. It might have been a courtroom, it might have been a theatre, and on trial, though he would not yet admit it, was Mr. Dunning, the bookseller. He stood near the hearth, his angular frame hunched, his lips drawn back in that perpetual sneer. The storm seemed to echo his bitterness, rattling the casement as if to punctuate each silence between them. Tommy broke that silence first. "You've denied Margaret's importance. You've mocked us for meddling. But here we are, Dunning, your past laid bare." Dunning's laugh was short, sharp. "Riddles, children's scribbles. You mistake fairy tales for evidence." Tuppence's eyes gleamed. Children see truths adults conceal. Margaret knew. She hid her knowledge in this book, and she paid with her life. And now Mrs. Harrow lies dead because she feared what these pages revealed. Lightning flared again, washing Dunning's face in ghastly white. His sneer faltered, if only for a second. Captain Reed sat apart in the high-backed chair by the window. His scar caught the light as he leaned forward, voice low and steady. "The cipher name's betrayal, Dunning, and betrayal was your trade during the war. Admit it." The bookseller's hands curled into fists. "Easy for you to say, soldier. You wore medals. I wore hunger. Ration permits revoked. Shop failing. No one cared whether I lived or starved. So yes, I listened when whispers came. Offers of food, safety in exchange for names." He spread his arms in sudden defiance. "And tell me, who among you would not have done the same faced with ruin?" "Many," said Tommy coldly. "And those who didn't died with honor. The agents you betrayed died nameless because of you." The wind howled, hurling rain against the glass. Tuppence leaned forward, her voice cutting through the storm. "And Margaret? Did you silence her too?" Dunning's mouth twisted. "She was a foolish girl, always scribbling, prying. She found the list one day, saw the names in a ledger I had carelessly left out. She confronted me, all childish bravery. I told her to forget. She would not. So I persuaded her. She left the village that night and never returned." His tone was almost proud. Tuppence's gaze did not waver. "Not persuaded, silenced." Reed rose, his voice ringing. "You killed her." Dunning snarled. "No proof. None. You have scraps of paper, a dead teacher's fears, and your suspicions. Nothing more." For a moment, triumph flared in his eyes. But then Tuppence reached into her handbag and drew out the children's satchel they had rescued from the attic. Slowly, deliberately, she slit the frayed lining. From within she pulled a single folded page, crumpled, ink blurred with age but still legible. The final page. She laid it on the table. Lightning blazed, illuminating the words scrawled in childish hand. "Dunning sells names. He must be stopped." The room froze. The words seemed to burn themselves into the oak. Dunning staggered back as though struck. His lips moved soundlessly before he found his voice rising to a shriek. "She lied. She was a child. She lied." "No," said Tuppence quietly. "Children exaggerate, but they do not invent betrayal where none exists. She knew, and she wrote your name, Mr. Dunning." The silence after her words was deeper than thunder. Then came the unravelling. Dunning lunged forward, sweeping the pages from the table, shouting, "Lies! All lies!" The candlesticks toppled, the brass lamp flickered dangerously. Tommy caught Tuppence's arm, pulling her back as the bookseller snatched up the incriminating page and thrust it toward the fire. But Reed was faster. With a soldier's precision, he blocked the hearth, wrenching the page from Dunning's grasp. They struggled, lightning painting them in savage outlines. At last Reed threw the traitor back against the table, where he collapsed, gasping, his defiance spent. The library door burst open. Villagers had gathered, drawn by the storm and the voices raised within. They crowded the threshold, men with hard eyes, women pale with fear. The constable shoved through, truncheon in hand. "Dunning," he said, voice grim, "you'll come with me." For a heartbeat, the bookseller sat motionless. Then, with a sudden animal fury, he lunged for the window. He wrenched it open, rain whipping in, and scrambled onto the sill. But the villagers surged forward, blocking escape. Reed seized him by the arm, hauling him back inside. Dunning crumpled to the floor, defeated at last. The storm raged on, but within the library a different stillness settled. The fragments of cipher, dampened but intact, lay strewn across the table. The final page rested safe in Reed's hand. Tuppence's voice was quiet but steady. "It's finished. Margaret's secret is told. She died, but not in vain." Tommy exhaled, long and weary. The curtain's down. The play's over. Later, As the constable led Dunning away through the storm-lashed night, the villagers murmured among themselves. Shock, grief, relief, all mingled. Reed stood at the door, rain plastering his hair to his brow, his scar stark in the lightning. He turned to Tommy and Tuppence. "You've done what none of us dared. She has justice now." Tuppence met his gaze. Justice, perhaps, but no peace, not for a child silenced, nor for a teacher who tried to warn us. When at last they returned to their room at the inn, exhaustion wrapped them like a heavy cloak. Yet the storm outside seemed less menacing now, its thunder more distant, its rain softer. Tuppence placed the pressed flower beside the final page, arranging them with care. "She left us her truth," she whispered, "and we carried it through." Tommy poured 2 glasses of brandy, raising his in solemn salute. "To Margaret Elston, may her silence speak no longer." They drank, the fire crackling low, and outside the storm passed, leaving only the hush of a village that would wake to a new dawn, its shadows at last brought into the light. Dawn crept slowly over Havisham, as if reluctant to lift the veil the storm had left behind. Mist hung low over the river, its waters swollen and sluggish after the night's deluge. Roofs glistened, gardens sagged with rain, and in the square a hush prevailed, a village shaken, yet strangely lighter, as though some ancient weight had at last been lifted. In the manor library, the smell of damp oak and extinguished candles lingered. The cipher fragments still lay upon the table, sodden at the edges but intact, mute witnesses to a night of revelation. Captain Reed stood by the window, gazing across the lawns where the storm's wreckage lay scattered, branches torn down, puddles gleaming like broken mirrors. He spoke without turning. "You'll wonder why I kept silent all these years." Tommy and Tuppence sat opposite, weary but attentive. The fire had been rekindled, its flames low and steady, a softer contrast to the violence that had raged outside. Reed's voice was quiet, almost stripped of its usual smoothness. "I knew Margaret came to me that night. I should have told the vicar, the constable, anyone. But I feared. Not fear of being named a traitor, though the village might have believed it. Fear of my own failures. The war left me scarred, yes, but worse, it left me broken. I had been careless with men's lives. Orders I gave at Anzio cost deaths. If I admitted to harbouring Margaret and she vanished, they would whisper that my failure had followed me home. So I chose silence." At last he turned, his eyes shadowed, and silence became cowardice. Tuppence's expression softened. "But you were not the traitor, Captain. Margaret's cipher makes it plain. She named Dunning." Reed bowed his head. "I feared she might have named me. That was my torment. And so I let her memory fade into rumour, while the true betrayer walked free." His voice thickened, and for once the scar across his face seemed less mark of battle than emblem of regret. Tommy leaned forward, his tone brisk but not unkind. "Well, Reed, the truth has had its night in court. Dunning's confession and Margaret's final page will settle that. You may forgive yourself in time." Reed gave a humourless smile. If only forgiveness were so easily summoned. Later that morning, the village gathered in the square, drawn as much by curiosity as by duty. The constable, red-eyed from lack of sleep, addressed them with halting authority. "Mr. Dunning is in custody. He's admitted to dealings in the war, passing names betraying our own. The evidence is clear. Margaret Elston discovered his treachery, and he silenced her. Mrs. Harrow, too, when she grew fearful." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Faces long closed tightened in shock, then eased in grim relief. One woman whispered, "Poor Margaret, all these years, and no one knew." Another muttered, "We suspected Reed. God forgive us. All our suspicions wasted." The vicar, pale but resolute, raised his voice. "Let us remember Margaret not as a victim, but as a child who tried to speak the truth. Her courage deserves honour." The crowd fell silent, heads bowed. For the first time in decades, Margaret's name was spoken without fear, without whisper. Back at the inn, Tuppence packed quietly, folding the satchel into her case. She paused, fingering the pressed flower still wrapped in her handkerchief. Its faded petals seemed fragile as ash, yet it had endured storm, attic, and secrecy. She said softly, "It feels wrong to take it with us." Tommy glanced over. "Perhaps leave it at the school," a silent tribute. Yes, she smiled faintly. Among the desks where she once sat, let it remind them that courage is not measured in years. They walked to the school that afternoon, the air fresh with washed earth and sunlight breaking through. In the garden where Mrs. Harrow had fallen, flowers bent under droplets of rain. The place seemed gentler, yet not emptied of sorrow. Tuppence knelt by the wall, placing the pressed flower carefully at the base of a rosebush. For a moment she bowed her head, lips moving in words too private for the air. Tommy touched her shoulder. "Goodbye, Margaret." As they strolled back through the village, they found the people quieter, yet less guarded. Doors once half shut now stood open. Voices, though subdued, no longer carried suspicion. Children played in the square again, their laughter incongruous, yet healing. "Strange, isn't it?" Tommy said. "A whole village held in thrall by silence, one man's treachery, one child's knowledge, and decades of shadows." Tuppence answered thoughtfully, "And it took a book, a children's book at that, to break the silence. Margins and scribbles, things adults dismissed, but they told the truth." By evening, trunks packed, tickets booked, they sat once more in the inn parlour. The fire crackled, cheerful this time, and the landlady fussed with tea as if to erase all memory of storms and suspicion. Reed entered quietly, his hat in hand. "You leave tomorrow?" "Yes," Tommy said. "Our part is done." Reed inclined his head. "I owe you both more than I can say, not merely for exposing Dunning, but for giving Margaret's voice its due." Tuppence smiled gently. "We only followed her trail. It was she who left it, in childish margins no one thought to read." Reed's eyes softened. "Then may she rest easier now." He hesitated, then added, "And may I learn to live less in silence." The next morning dawned calm. Blue sky stretched clear over Havisham, the storm a memory. The river flowed smooth, carrying reflections of cottages and willows as if nothing had disturbed its course. The Beresfords boarded the train, steam hissing as it pulled from the platform. From the carriage window they watched the village recede, the manor's roofline, the church spire, the schoolyard, where a pressed flower lay hidden among roses. Tommy leaned back with a sigh of relief. "Well, Tuppence, another case closed, though hardly the holiday we imagined." She chuckled softly. "No, but Margaret deserved to be heard, and sometimes it takes outsiders to make a village listen." He reached across, squeezing her hand. "We'll tell the story one day. A children's book, a cipher, a girl who knew too much, not the sort of tale to forget." Tuppence looked out at the passing fields, her voice quiet but firm. "No, nor should it be forgotten. She was brave, and though she vanished, her truth remained. That is her legacy." The train gathered speed, carrying them back toward London, back toward the ordinary world. Behind them, in a riverside village no longer bound by whispers, Margaret Elston's story lay at last complete. Truth laid bare beneath a sky washed clean. The London streets welcomed them back with their usual din. Buses grumbling, bells clanging, the ceaseless patter of footsteps across wet pavements. Yet for Tommy and Tuppence, the noise seemed almost unreal after the quiet intensity of Havisham. The war had ended years before, but in that riverside village they had brushed close against its shadows once more, shadows that still whispered of betrayal, secrecy, and loss. By late afternoon they were settled again in their own sitting room, fire brisk in the grate, familiar armchairs drawn close. The comfort of home wrapped round them like a well-worn coat, the ticking of their own clock, the faint chime of a church bell across the way, the scent of fresh tea brewing. Tommy sprawled with studied laziness, one foot stretched toward the hearthrug. The newspaper cast aside. He regarded his wife with mock gravity. "I dare say I'll never look at fairy tales the same way again. Cedric the squirrel will haunt me. Every time I open a children's book I shall expect coded warnings about espionage." Tuppence, perched more neatly in her chair, poured the tea with her usual precision. "And why not? Fairy tales are often darker than they appear. Wolves, poisoned apples, witches in disguise. Why shouldn't a children's book hide real dangers too?" He accepted his cup, adding sugar with exaggerated care. "Still, it feels rather unsporting, doesn't it? A war fought in margins and scribbles." Her eyes were thoughtful. "Wars are fought wherever courage finds its place. Margaret was only a girl, but she dared to preserve what she knew. It cost her life, but it also unmasked a traitor. That is more than many grown men can claim. Silence fell for a time, companionable, broken only by the clink of porcelain and the soft crackle of flames. Outside, rain tapped at the window, gentler now, nothing like the violent storm that had marked their last night in Havisham. Tommy stretched again. Reed will recover, I suppose. The poor devil's carried his own ghost too long. He will, Tuppence said quietly. He was never the traitor, only a man broken by war and afraid of suspicion. His silence cost dearly, but at least he now has truth for company. And the village? They'll heal. Villages always do once truth has light. The whispers will fade, the schoolyard will echo with laughter again, but Margaret's name will not vanish, nor should it. Tommy studied her face, softened by the fire's glow. You're thinking of the flower? Yes, she smiled faintly. It rests in the school garden now, a quiet memorial. No plaque, no speeches, just a child's pressed petals left among roses. Fitting, don't you think? Very. He lifted his cup in mock salute to Margaret Elston, scribe of squirrels, breaker of codes. Tuppence's smile trembled toward solemnity, to courage in unexpected places. They drank. The clock chimed 6. Twilight folded itself across the sitting room, shadows lengthening in corners. Tuppence rose to draw the curtains, pausing to glance at the street below. Lamplight gleamed on wet cobblestones, reflections winking like secrets half revealed. She said softly, almost to herself, "Strange how secrets linger. Years pass, wars end, but betrayal waits in the quietest corners. And yet, a book, a scribble, a pressed flower, these small things can break the silence." Tommy chuckled, though gently. "Trust you, Tuppence, to make tea philosophical. Most wives would simply complain about draughts." She turned, eyes bright with amusement. "And most husbands would miss the point entirely, which is why you have me." "Indeed," he said, mock-sighing. "Life would be dreadfully dull otherwise." They settled once more by the fire, the evening drawing in. Tuppence laid aside her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. "There's something humbling," she said, "in remembering that we were only messengers. Margaret was the true detective in her way. She gathered the fragments. She recorded the truth. We simply pieced together what she left behind." Tommy nodded. And if her cipher was clumsy, it was no less brave. Children do not think of consequence, only of truth. She paid dearly, but she made certain someone would one day understand. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire's glow deepened, the room hushed around them. At last Tommy rose, stretching with mock ceremony. "Well, Tuppence, we have returned with no medals, no headlines, just another quiet adventure tucked into our days." She looked up at him, her smile tinged with affection. "And isn't that what we wanted all along? Not fame, but truth, and perhaps a little justice for those forgotten." "True enough." He bent, kissed her lightly on the forehead, and added with his old mischief, "Though I still prefer my fairy tales without traitors. Give me a dragon any day." She laughed, the sound soft and warm. "Be careful, Tommy. You may get your wish yet." The fire burned lower. They finished their tea, the comfort of home enfolding them at last. Outside, the rain ceased and the sky cleared to reveal a scattering of stars. Tuppence gazed into the embers, her thoughts lingering in that riverside village, on a child's courage, on a truth scribbled in margins. She whispered, more to the night than to Tommy, "Even the simplest stories can carry the heaviest truths." And in the quiet that followed, with the storm past and the world at peace for now, it seemed the shadows of war had at last loosened their hold.